Hey everyone, I'm out here in the garage with the RL next to me, and that's because the RL is the subject of another video. So basically, I'm just going to keep adding videos to this library of videos on the RL, but I thought I'd talk about spark plugs in today's video. So stay tuned. Alright, so as I've talked about many times on this channel, I've bought this car back in 2016 and had 176,000 miles at the time. But the previous owner took very good care of the car. It was always serviced at the dealer. But I bought it because the car had a bad head gasket. So what I ended up doing was replacing the engine and put the car back on the road. So other than that, the car is mechanically in really good shape. But what we're going to do today is take a look at the spark plugs. I don't suspect we need to replace the spark plugs at all because I've only got about 40,000 miles on them. But I would like to at least take a look at them. And so during this video, you'll be able to see how you would replace the spark plugs on the Acura RL. So the typical recommendation for replacing spark plugs is 105,000 miles or 84 months, whichever soonest. I am nowhere near that, obviously, at around 3 years and about 40,000 miles. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at the spark plugs, but at the same time, I'm going to kind of show you some things I look at when I'm looking at spark plugs on my car. So let's jump into it. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and unclip this air conditioning line from the strut bar. Get that out of here. All right. Now what we need to do is go ahead and take the strut bar off. So there are two nuts right there. There are two bolts here, and then there are two nuts on the other side that mirror these nuts here. So we're going to go ahead and get those off. Those are 12 millimeters. Then we're just going to go ahead and lift this out. Alright, so the next thing to do is go ahead and get the engine cover off. So we've got a bolt right here. We've got a nut right there. Another nut. And then we've got two bolts down in the front here to take off. I'm going to take these off first, and then I'll come and get these last two bolts there. And those are 10 millimeters. There's our bolt. First nut. And our second nut. Okay? Then we'll take off these two bolts down here. Those are 10 millimeters also. There's one. There's our second bolt. Then just pull up on the cover. It comes right off. Very simple. Alright, so if we take a look at the engine, we've got 6 coil packs. We've got one here, one there, then 3 more on this side here. So I'm just going to do one cylinder because I don't need to replace my spark plugs, but I just want to kind of give you an example of what they look like, or what I look for, I should say, and then we'll go from there. So I'm going to work on this cylinder. So I'm going to go ahead and disconnect right there. Disconnect that connector. Alright, so then there are two bolts on the top of this coil pack. One here and one here. Take those off. Those are 8mm. There's one. And our second one. Then just go ahead and pull the coil pack out. Lift up like that. It comes right out. Alright, so we have the coil pack on the bench over here, and I like to look at these when I pull my spark plugs just to make sure there's no issues with them, because the last thing you want to have happen is to not look at these and then find out later on you have a torn boot somewhere, and then you have a possible misfire develop. And sometimes misfire issues can be a little bit of a pain to trace down. So I like to take these coil packs out when I'm changing my spark plugs and just look them over. So I'm looking for a torn boot first of all. I don't see anything like that here. I also check inside there. You may not be able to see it, but I look inside there to see if there's any sort of corrosion or anything else that might be in there, like oil. I take a look in there, and then I look at the housing itself, make sure there's no cracks anywhere, and if I don't see any cracks, then we're pretty much in good shape. So another test you can do is a resistance test, and that's really only necessary if you suspect you have issues. So I can kind of walk you through this real quick, and we'll do a quick resistance test on this coil pack. Alright, so if you look inside here, there are 3 terminals. They're numbered 1 through 3. So 1 is the bottom terminal, 2, and then 3 is the top terminal. So I'm going to go ahead and clip my probe here on terminal number 2. Right on there. Like that. And then I'm also going to set my multimeter on here. You can see that. It's on the resistance setting. And what I'm going to do is touch my probe on terminal number 1. And you can see 1.9 ohms. So the typical resistance for these coil packs is 0.9 to 1.1 ohms. We got 1.9, and that's because this is still pretty warm. So I'm not worried about this one at all. I think it's just fine. Alright, so let's move on to the spark plug. I'm going to go ahead and pull that next. So I've got a 5/8" spark plug socket. This one is magnetic. So I'll talk a little bit in a bit why I prefer to use this one over any other spark plug socket. Now they do have spark plug sockets that have rubber grommets on them. Those are just fine. But I prefer to use magnetic spark plug socket and an extension. So go ahead and put that on there. And normally what I like to do when I'm pulling spark plugs, if I'm not familiar with the car, I had a Mazda Protege I worked on. And I like to take it nice and slow when I'm pulling these because you never know what you're going to find. The Mazda Protege I worked on, the spark plugs were actually almost welded in there. And I had to kind of pull the spark plugs out in about quarter turn increments. It was pretty harrowing doing that one. So I'm going to go ahead and pull the spark plug on this one. I'm not worried about it seizing at all. So let's go ahead and do that. Put that in there. And just twist it. Alright, and I personally don't like to use power tools on these. I just use hand tools. So I'm going to go ahead and twist this out the rest of the way. That should be loose now. Let's go ahead and pull it out. And there it is. Alright, so here's a spark plug, and I like to be very cautious with these. Either keep them on the socket or put them in a tray here, because if you drop them and they fall on the tip, you're probably going to look at buying a new spark plug. So what I'm going to do here is go ahead and take it off the socket and take a close look at it. You can see this one's got kind of a little bit of blackness around there, around the top. So it's starting to show a little bit of wear. Also, I look at the electrode. You can probably barely see that. I'll put a picture up of the electrode. But you want to make sure that's nice and flat. If it starts to round a little bit, then most likely it's time to replace your spark plugs. And then I also look here. Make sure there's no soot or charring on there. This one doesn't look too bad. I'm just going to go ahead and clean it up a little bit before I put it back on the car. I also look at the threads next, and what I'm looking for there is if there's any oil. If I see a lot of oil on the threads, then that's probably a sign that we've got a leaking spark plug tube seal. And in that case, most likely you're going to have to replace your spark plug tube seals and your valve cover gaskets. Last thing I'm going to look at here is I'm going to look at the porcelain. And what I'm looking for here is any cracking. If I see any cracking, or if it looks really brown, like this one's starting to show, like I said, a little bit of wear, then I would most likely replace the spark plug at that point. This one right now, I'm just going to go ahead and leave it as is, and I'm just going to clean it up a little bit. So how I usually like to clean spark plugs, I try not to use anything abrasive like this brush here. This is a wire brush, but this one's probably a little bit too abrasive. So what I'll do a lot of times is grab a brass brush and use that. The one last thing I want to check too before I put the spark plug back in the car is I want to check the gap on this. The typical gap on these spark plugs is 0.043 inches, but the maximum is allowed is 0.051 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and check that gap using this tool here. And all I do is slide it in there carefully. Slide it in there between the electrode and the tip. Just carefully slide that around until I feel some resistance, like about right there. And then I'm going to stop. And I've got around 0.047 inches. So that's still in pretty good shape. I'm probably suspecting, I would say probably in the next 40,000 miles I'll go ahead and replace these spark plugs. But what I'm going to do now is just go ahead and take a brass brush, clean this up, and then put it back in the car. So I'm going to go ahead and clean off the threads first. I would use a brass brush probably on the electrode area. Be very careful, like I said, with that. But on the threads you should be able to use one of these wire brushes here, the steel brushes. Alright, that's probably about as clean as we're going to get it. Take the brass brush and carefully clean this off here. A lot of times you really don't have to do much to these. I just happen to have this out and I figured why not. If you have to do a lot of cleaning on these, it's probably best just to replace your spark plug. Alright, so the recommended spark plug for this car is the NGK PFR5L-11. That's what this one is here. You can also use the Denso PK16PR-L11. Alright, so I've got the spark plug back on the socket there. Like I said, I don't like to have the spark plug off the socket and just in my hands. So what I'm going to do now is go ahead and put a little bit of anti-seize thread lubricant on here. This actually is a high temp formula that resists temperatures up to about 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And so you just need a little bit of anti-seize on there, not a whole lot, it doesn't take much. So here's the anti-seize I'm going to go ahead and put on here. I'm just going to put a little dab on there. And I'm going to keep it off the tip too. That's one thing you don't want to do is get it on the tip. So that's about all I'm going to put on there. And then when we spin it in the hole, it'll fill in the threads. So as I mentioned in the Acura Legend video, one other reason why I like to use these magnetic spark plug sockets is that when you're putting the spark plug back in the hole, that prevents the spark plug from dropping and possibly damaging your tip. So let's go ahead and put this back in. I'm going to thread it in by hand first until I feel resistance right there. And then I'm going to grab my torque wrench and torque this down to 13 foot-pounds. So that is a very important step that I even before didn't do a lot. I would always just tighten them down really tight and then I'd have a tough time getting them out sometimes. Or if you don't tighten them down enough, then what can happen is you can have issues with your car the way it runs. Alright, here's our torque wrench. Alright, nice and tight. Next I'm going to put the coil pack back in. Just make sure it's nice and seated. And then I'll put the two bolts back in. Those are 8 millimeters. Alright. So I'm going to go ahead and put these two bolts back in. Alright, and the torque spec on those is 8.7 foot-pounds. I'm just going to tighten it down to 9 foot-pounds. There we go. And I'll put the connector back on. Make sure it snaps on. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and put the engine cover back on. Now there is a recommended bolt and nut installation sequence. So we're gonna go ahead and put the cover on first. Get that lined up. It's always kind of a little bit difficult to find where the studs are. We'll get those lined up here. There it goes. All right, so the two bolts that go in the front, those go in first, and then everything else up top goes in last. Torque spec, I believe, is around 8 foot-pounds. And once again, those are 10 millimeters. So I get this first one put in there up front. So I got that one started. I'll put the second one in. Right there. You don't necessarily have to use a torque wrench if you don't want to. I really don't honestly use one on these. So I'm just going to grab my ratchet here. I'm not going to torque these down. I'm just going to make sure they're nice and tight. Okay, so we've got our two nuts. One goes here. And the other one goes over here. Then we've got our bolt that goes right there. And just tighten it down. That should be good enough. Then the last thing we're going to do is go ahead and put the strut bar in. There's a strut bar. Let's pull the air conditioning line forward a little bit. There we go. Then I'll put the nuts and the bolts back in. Those are 12 millimeters. Two nuts here. Two bolts back here. And then two more nuts back over here. And the torque spec on the nuts and the bolts is 16 foot-pounds. I'm going to go ahead and put this hose back in, the clips here, so it's out of my way. There we go. Now I can go ahead and tighten these two nuts. There's one. Alright, okay, so let's go ahead and tighten these two nuts and these two bolts. 16 foot-pounds, 12 millimeters. Alright, and that's it. Alright, so there's a spark plug replacement procedure for the 1999 Acura RL. Very easy on this car. I've worked on other V6 engines where it's like almost major surgery just to get to the spark plugs. So this one's really easy. Hopefully the information I provided on what I look for when I'm replacing spark plugs was also helpful. I think it's very important, in my opinion, to look at the health of your engine when you're replacing the spark plugs, because that can tell you a lot about what's going on in there. If you're getting a lot of oil in the cylinders, or if you got some combustion issues going on where maybe your spark plugs are really dark, maybe you've got a lot of carbon buildup, that can also tell you maybe you have a misfire going on. So that's one thing. If you look at the Acura Legend videos, I talked a lot about that in those videos and where I had a misfire. The spark plugs were just really charred. So hopefully that was helpful information, and thanks for watching.